Is the Bible untranslatable? After all, it's written in languages now long dead. It's set in the context of cultures long gone, and it stretches the words that it uses to their limits. Difficulty piled on difficulty for the translator. But that hasn't stopped many translators from trying. The Bible is by far the most translated book, bar none. Well, let's look at a selection of examples that illustrate these three main problem areas and how some translators have dealt with them. Problem 1, the Bible is written in languages that are now dead. This means that there are no speakers of Bible Greek or Bible Hebrew who we can ask about how they understand it. Sure, there's modern Greek and modern Hebrew, but they've undergone many changes from the ancient versions of those languages. This certainly is a problem, but we do have some good ways to compensate. Archaeology. In 1 Samuel 13:1, we read the word pim. For a long time, this word was unknown. They speculated, is it a form of pay mouth? But now, thanks to archaeology, weights have been found bearing the name pim, and we found out that it is 2/3 of a shekel in weight. Here's another question. Is China mentioned in the Bible? In the Masoretic text, we read Sinim at Isaiah 49:12, and this was taken to be China. But since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls quite recently, the vowels are shown in that word. In the Masoretic text, the old Masoretic text, no vowels or very few vowels are shown. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some more of the vowels are shown, and it's seen that the word is Suwaniyim, which refers to the inhabitants of modern Aswan. Then the deciphering of Ugaritic, a closely related language to ancient Hebrew, has increased our understanding of biblical Hebrew. And here's an example from the New Testament. In 2 Thessalonians 3:6, the word ataktos was translated disorderly in the King James Version. Every brother that walketh disorderly. This was in fact the old meaning of the word in classical Greek. But papyri from a later period, these papyri are just little scraps of papyrus paper that have been found in the sand, buried for centuries, for millennia, in the dry sand in Egypt, showed that it came to mean idly. And in 2 Thessalonians 3:7, verse 7 and 11, it's clear that this is what Paul meant by this word. So here are three interesting things that have helped us to get a better understanding of the ancient languages that the Bible is written in. But despite all this, difficulties remain, and some translators have felt justified in giving up in some places. A Swedish translation called Bible 2000 has 67 places in the Old Testament where they just have ... where they say this is impossible, we can't translate this. Example, Genesis 15, the second part of verse 2. The word Selah, the NIV 1984 transliterates, in other words, just writes out Selah, copies the sounds of the Hebrew word in English letters without trying to translate it to give its meaning. But the NIV 2011 doesn't translate or give any equivalent, but it has a footnote saying the Hebrew has Selah, a word of uncertain meaning here. Well, my father was a carpenter, and I can remember helping him once with a door in his house. The door was hard to remove, and Dad took a hammer to it. He said, if it's your job to get this fixed, you have to fix it. You can't go to the boss and say, sorry, I can't do it. In the same way, it's the translator's job to translate. He can't say, sorry, too hard. He has to give it his best shot. Peter Craigie, in his Word Biblical Commentary on Psalms 1 to 50, talks about the meaning of Selah, which first occurs at Psalm 3:2. He considers the Septuagint rendering Dia Psalma the most likely, in which case the meaning could be pause, or instrumental interlude, or possibly louder. The translator should opt for one of these, and then there can be a footnote saying the meaning is uncertain. The NLT does that, using the translation interlude. Well, I mean, the translators are the ones who are supposed to know, so they've got to give it their best shot, and then they can put a footnote saying, well, we're not really sure, this is our best guess. But I mean, you can't really go to the boss and say, sorry, can't do it. Problem 2. The Bible is set in the context of a time and culture now long gone. This difficulty is no less acute than the first one. And an interesting aspect of it is that modern Western culture is so very different to any other culture there has ever been. Here's some examples. Watchful servants. Modern egalitarian society doesn't like the idea of servants and masters. And when it says in verse 37 that the master will serve the servant, a modern reader says, so he jolly well should. Anyway, the lazy layabout. Beating your servant is a particularly bad thing to do. It could get you into all sorts of trouble today. But interestingly, our own society had servants and masters as a totally acceptable aspect of the order of things up until quite recently. Here's another example, 1 Corinthians 13:12. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. But you can see your face perfectly in any cheap mirror today. In the ancient world, though, they didn't have nice silver-backed glass mirrors like we have. They simply used polished metal, which does indeed give a poor reflection. And an additional fact to note is that Corinth was famous for the mirrors. It made the polished metal mirrors, something Paul obviously had in mind as he searched for the best way to explain his point to them here. Well, if the translator could consult Paul, I'm sure he would say, it's the meaning that's important. You don't have to talk about mirrors. Pick something else by all means, something your audience knows. Get my meaning across. When discussing translation with study groups in New Zealand, I would throw the question open at this stage. What do you suggest? Good answers I received include in a mist or by the first light of dawn. In the Urupif translation, Urupif in Vanuatu, where I helped with the translation, we could do it with mirrors because the silver backing on the cheap mirrors people bought in the stores there quickly deteriorated. After experiencing how bad they were for shaving, I realized how suitable they were for Paul's illustration in that case. There's another example, Matthew 9:17 in the NRSV, neither is new wine put into old wineskins. This again is a custom unknown to us today, but again, it was once practiced in Western countries. We read in chapter 2 of Thomas Hardy's Under the Greenwood Tree, set in mid-19th century England, how a hogshead of cider is opened, and in the process, the cider spurts everywhere. So Matthew 9:17 was readily and immediately understood, even by people in Europe, right up until then. But here's what William Buckley did in his translation. In the 20th century, nor do people pour new fermenting wine into old wineskins that have lost their elasticity. Note here the brief and unobtrusive additions which Barclay expertly inserts to give background information and explain the situation to the modern urban reader. But my preferred solution is to use a cultural substitution, and here we have the cotton patch version. Nor do people put new tubes into old, bald tires. This makes it clear, immediate, and forceful, just like the original was. Here's another interesting one, Jude 12. They are clouds without rain, talking about false teachers. This is clearly written from the viewpoint of the traditional rural farmer who wants rain, not the townie who doesn't. In fact, I listened to a sermon a little while ago by a modern Western preacher who said, who talked about clouds threatening rain. There's the point of view of the modern townie. A cloud threatens rain. But from the point of view of the rural farmer, the cloud promises rain. And he is very annoyed when promising clouds appear, but they scud away without giving the rain that he really wants and needs. So interestingly, the view on this thing has turned around. The view has turned around 180 degrees. And so the modern reader doesn't quite get the point. In Luke 23:31, Jesus says to the women of Jerusalem who are crying for him on his way to be crucified, "If this can happen when the wood is green, what do you think will happen when it is dry?" Well, what exactly did Jesus mean? This probably was a common saying at the time. It would be well appreciated in any traditional rural society where fires have to be lit every day. The context also helps us with the meaning, which I suggest is the violence you're seeing here is nothing compared to the violence that's going to happen. Just like the fire you get trying to light green wood is nothing compared to what you get lighting dry wood. Now, he's referring to the way the Romans were to crush the great rebellion that the Jews made against the Romans in AD 66, just a generation after Jesus' death. Here's another one, 1 Corinthians 15:36, where Paul discusses the resurrection. When I was talking about this with the Urpiv translator, we hit upon a better way to translate it. Let me explain how we came to it. In Vanuatu, people don't plant grains. Root crops are their staples, and for many, the yam is the main one. Some varieties of yam grow over 2 meters long. When planting them, people first dig out the hole into which the new yam will grow. Stones are removed and the soil is carefully crumbled between the hands and then put back into the hole. The seed yam is inserted into a small side hole near the surface of the ground. The growing vine is guided on trellises. It takes 6 months for the new yam to grow. Someone told me once that his yams had died. "Oh, sorry," I said. "No, I mean they're ready," he said. "The vine has died. We just say the yam has died." So I went back to the translator and said to him, "Can we use yams in the translation instead of wheat?" And so we did. It was perfect. When you dig your yams, the old ones are shriveled and rotten, but the new ones are fresh, big, strong, and perfect. It became very meaningful for both of us. It's a remarkable illustration of the resurrection. Not only that, I think it's a real pointer to, and even a kind of evidence for, the resurrection, as other things in nature are, such as the return of spring. Well, problem 3, the Bible stretches the limits of its language. Just a few examples here. In Romans 10, the shades of meaning of dikaiasune, first gloss translation, righteousness, vary kaleidoscopically. That's what C.H. Dodd said. The norm of right conduct, as ordained by God, The divine action to vindicate right, the status of being in the right, or being acceptable to God. A selection of the meanings that Paul just jumps between these meanings and makes it quite difficult for a learner of the language. Probably even the original native speakers of the language would have been puzzling to try and keep up with him. But the problem is even greater for a modern learner of Greek or for the translator. Romans 14, this chapter is held together in a remarkable way by repeated use of the word krino, judge, and its different forms and compounds. This is a rhetorical technique used by Greek and Roman writers, and it was regarded as a mark of excellent style. It also provides tight unity and coherence to our passage. But translator usually can't follow it. That's a problem. 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, I've dealt with this in another video. It's a wonderful passage discussing the Lord's coming. It contains several word plays. The word sleep was a common euphemism, a nice way of talking about death. And it's used with this meaning here, but then here it's used to mean not be watchful, that is, fall into sin. There's a parallel play on the day, which first means the day of Christ's return, but also comes to mean the same as light as opposed to darkness. Finally, in verse 10, we have a summary. He died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. Here, awake or asleep could mean three things. 1, literally awake or asleep. 2, alive or dead. 3, watchful, sinless, or not. I think Paul intended all three meanings here. But how can the translator get that? Because the word in the translator's language probably wouldn't stretch in the same way as those original Greek words. So there we have a bit of a problem. And as I've said in other videos, every translation loses something. So it's true. In a real sense, the Bible is untranslatable, which is a good argument for taking time and effort to learn the original languages as best we can. Okay, in conclusion, I note the delightful title, The New Testament Yet Once Again, corrected by William Tyndale. He was spared further pain and trouble of correcting his translation by being martyred the next year. And here's a little example that I like, which shows how I think translation should be done, which is the best way to compensate for the problems that I've been talking about. Acts 27:34, which word for word says, not even a hair of your heads will be lost. But I advocate changing it to the English idiom, which communicates with the same vividness and meaningfulness as the original. You won't get so much as a scratch.